Welcome back to the EMA International Deep Dive Podcast. I'm Eric, and as always, I'm joined by Anna.
Today, we're diving into a topic that has become increasingly important across the pharmaceutical and biotechnology industries, especially for organizations focused on expanding patient access globally while still maintaining a commercially viable and regulatorily sustainable development strategy.
And that topic is the EU-M4All pathway.
Now, this is a program that many organizations have heard about, but in practice, there's still a tremendous amount of misunderstanding around what EU-M4All actually is, what it enables, and more importantly, what it realistically takes operationally to execute successfully.
Because when people first hear about EU-M4All, the concept sounds relatively straightforward.
The idea is that organizations can leverage the scientific and regulatory framework of the European Medicines Agency, or EMA, to support access to medicines in markets outside the European Union, particularly low and middle income countries where there may be substantial unmet medical need.
And conceptually, that sounds incredibly attractive.
You potentially avoid having to create completely disconnected regulatory strategies market by market, and instead create a more centralized pathway that can support broader global access.
But once you move beyond the concept and begin operationalizing the strategy, the complexity becomes very real very quickly.
Because this is not simply a regulatory submission exercise.
It becomes an enterprise-wide coordination effort involving regulatory affairs, CMC strategy, analytical development, manufacturing readiness, supply chain logistics, quality systems, clinical planning, regional authority engagement, and commercial access considerations all at the same time. And honestly, that's one of the biggest misconceptions we see in industry.
Organizations sometimes assume EUM4All is just another regulatory pathway.
But in reality, it is a highly integrated global access strategy that requires a tremendous amount of cross-functional alignment.
And if that alignment is missing early, the downstream impact can be enormous.
You start seeing duplicated studies, conflicting regulatory assumptions, manufacturing readiness gaps, delayed technology transfer activities, and ultimately significant timeline extensions that could have been avoided with earlier strategic planning.
And that's really where the work becomes interesting.
Recently, our team at EMA International supported a multinational pharmaceutical sponsor that was working to expand access to a critical therapy across multiple underserved global markets.
Their objective was not simply to gain approval in one geography.
The objective was to create a scalable, globally aligned pathway that balanced speed, regulatory sustainability, manufacturing feasibility, and long-term commercial viability.
And from the beginning, one of the largest challenges was determining how to create alignment across multiple health authorities that each had slightly different expectations, priorities, because even though EMA may serve as the central scientific framework for EUM4All, local health authorities still maintain their own requirements, expectations, and operational realities.
And companies sometimes underestimate how important those local considerations become. You have to think about questions like, where will the bioequivalence study be conducted? Will the local authority accept foreign-generated data? Does the CRO have sufficient inspection history and credibility? How will the manufacturing strategy support local importation requirements? What stability conditions are required regionally? Will local authorities expect supplemental comparability data? How will labeling and pharmacovigilance obligations be managed? And none of those decisions happen in isolation. Every one of those decisions influences timelines, cost, technical development strategy, and long-term regulatory sustainability. And another major discussion area was around regulatory engagement strategy itself, because one of the most common questions companies ask are, do we pursue EMA scientific advice? Do we conduct a pre-submission meeting? Do we move directly into submission-enabling activities? Do we engage local authorities first? And those are not minor decisions. Those decisions can fundamentally alter the trajectory of the program. Because while early health authority engagement can significantly reduce uncertainty, it also has to be done strategically. If you engage too early without a sufficiently mature development strategy, you may create unnecessary questions or commitments that become difficult operationally later. But if you engage too late, you may discover critical gaps after major investments have already been made. So, one of EMA International's major roles was helping the client determine where engagement would create the most strategic value while still maintaining program agility. And that included evaluating not just the regulatory pathway itself, but also the technical maturity of the program. Because the regulatory strategy and the CMC strategy have to evolve together. And this is another area where organizations frequently run into problems. They treat regulatory and technical development as separate work streams. But in reality, regulators evaluate the totality of the program. They're evaluating whether your manufacturing process is sufficiently controlled, whether your analytical methods are appropriate, whether your characterization package supports comparability, whether your stability program reflects actual use conditions, whether your commercial control strategy is scientifically justified, and whether the entire development lifecycle demonstrates an adequate understanding of product quality. So during this engagement, Emma worked extensively to align activities occurring across multiple development phases. That included characterization strategy for engineering batches, comparability planning, validation sequencing, analytical method strategy, and defining which studies would ultimately support both the bioequivalence program and the future commercial submission package. And that level of alignment becomes critical, because without it, companies often end up repeating studies later. Or worse, generating data that regulators ultimately determine is not sufficiently representative or submission supportive. And one particularly important topic was bioequivalence strategy, because there were extensive discussions internally around where the study should be conducted and how to maximize the global utility of the resulting data package. And this is where EU-M4All becomes especially nuanced, because scientifically a study may be entirely sound. But regulatorily, acceptability can still vary significantly depending on study location, CRO oversight history, population selection, regional authority expectations, and inspection readiness. And duplicate BE studies can become extraordinarily expensive and time-consuming. So rather than approaching EMA and regional authority expectations as disconnected activities, EMA International worked to identify areas where alignment could realistically be achieved. That included evaluating potential CRO partners, inspection readiness history, regional regulatory precedents, data acceptability risk, operational feasibility, and long-term submission scalability. And importantly, this wasn't simply about minimizing work. It was about designing a strategy that could realistically survive regulatory scrutiny across multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. And beyond the regulatory and clinical strategy, there was also a major operational and manufacturing component. Because global access programs are heavily dependent on supply chain reliability and manufacturing coordination. And once multiple international manufacturing partners become involved, complexity increases dramatically. You may have drug substance manufacturing occurring in one country, drug product manufacturing occurring somewhere else, analytical testing occurring at another site, and then final distribution occurring across entirely different regions, with varying importation requirements and logistical constraints. And every handoff introduces risk: technology transfer risk, cold chain risk, data integrity risk, deviation management risk, supply chain timing risk, and quality system alignment risk. So EMA International also played a central coordination role across the broader manufacturing and operational network, helping align technical expectations, communication pathways, documentation strategy, quality oversight, and timeline execution across all participating organizations. And that type of coordination becomes even more important in accelerated programs. Because when timelines compress, organizations have less room for error. One delayed analytical method, one unresolved comparability question, one shipment excursion, one stability gap, one incomplete validation package, and suddenly the entire timeline shifts. And another major discussion area involved real-world product use considerations.
Because regulators increasingly expect organizations to demonstrate that the product has been evaluated under conditions that reflect actual clinical and operational use.
And this becomes especially important when products are intended for diverse global environments. So there were extensive discussions around studies such as in-use stability, photostability, hold time studies, transportation qualification, environmental exposure risk, temperature excursion management, container closure integrity.
and long term storage considerations,
And while those studies may sound operational, they directly influence regulatory confidence in product quality and usability.
especially in regions where environmental conditions, distribution infrastructure, and clinical practices may differ significantly from traditional Western commercial markets.
And honestly, this is one of the most important mindset shifts companies need to make with global access programs.
This is not simply about obtaining approval,
It is about creating a sustainable product lifecycle strategy that works operationally in the real world.
and that means thinking far beyond the submission itself. And another major area where Emma added value was stakeholder management.
Because these programs often involve dozens of stakeholders operating with different objectives, different timelines, and different assumptions.
Without centralized coordination, fragmentation becomes almost inevitable
And fragmentation is dangerous.
because fragmented programs generate inconsistent decision making.
They create communication gaps.
They create duplicated work.
They create disconnected technical assumptions. And they create regulatory risk.
So, Emma International acted not only as a regulatory and technical advisor, but also as a strategic integrator, helping ensure that all components of the program remained aligned to the same overall objective.
And that included maintaining alignment between executive leadership, regulatory affairs teams, manufacturing organizations, analytical laboratories, development partners, and regional stakeholders.
And I think this is where the industry overall is evolving.
Historically, many consulting models focused on highly siloed support. Regulatory here, quality there, CMC somewhere else, supply chain somewhere else. But modern global access programs require integrated strategy because regulators increasingly evaluate organizational understanding holistically. And organizations that operate in silos often struggle to maintain consistency across the entire development lifecycle.
And as global regulatory expectations continue evolving, we're seeing increasing emphasis on lifecycle management, knowledge management, comparability science, data integrity, supply chain resilience, and operational sustainability.
Which means the future of global regulatory strategy is becoming far more interconnected than many organizations anticipated even 5 or 10 years ago. And honestly, that's one of the reasons EU-M4All programs are becoming so strategically important. They force organizations to think globally from the beginning, rather than retrofitting global access later.
And while that creates complexity up front, it can also create tremendous long term value when executed correctly.
Absolutely. And ultimately, one of the biggest takeaways from this engagement was the importance of early alignment.
The earlier organizations align regulatory strategy, manufacturing strategy, analytical strategy, and operational execution, the more flexibility they maintain throughout the program lifecycle.
And flexibility becomes critical in accelerated global programs.
Because unexpected challenges will always emerge.
The question is whether the program structure is resilient enough to absorb those challenges without destabilizing the broader strategy.
And that's really where integrated program leadership becomes the differentiator.
Not simply executing individual tasks, but creating a connected strategy that allows organizations to move efficiently while still maintaining scientific rigor, compliance, and long-term scalability.
And for organizations considering EU-M4All, that's probably the most important lesson.
Success is rarely determined by one single submission activity. It's determined by how effectively the entire program ecosystem is aligned from the beginning. We'd love to hear from our listeners. Have you worked on an EUM4All program or another global access initiative?
What challenges have you encountered around regulatory alignment, manufacturing coordination, or cross regional strategy? Send us your questions or topics at info@minternational.com.
And in our next episode, we'll continue exploring how global regulatory strategy is evolving, including the growing role of integrated development planning, accelerated manufacturing readiness, and how companies can reduce global commercialization risk while still moving quickly.
Thanks again for joining us on the Emma International Deep Dive podcast.